Remembering it very clearly is often taken as a sign that we remember it accurately. So when you have a really vivid experience and you sort of feel like you can play it back to yourself, we generally assume that it's right, because often things that are more vivid to us are more likely to be right. But that vividness doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. I have really vivid memories of how I learned about the attacks on September 11th, and I verified them and it turns out they're wrong. Play it back in my mind. I still see several of my graduate students there who weren't there, and I still don't see the person who was actually in the room with me at the time we learned about it.
I think a big trap in decision making is not considering enough options, because almost always there's something that seems good, right? There's some default, there's something that seems good to do, there's something that presents itself. And when it comes to situations of deception, one big problem we have is not asking enough questions before we make a decision.
Welcome to the Performance Initiative Podcast.
Our goal is to provide you and ourselves with the tools to be the best versions of ourselves.
We are your hosts, Dr. Grant Cooper
and Dr. Zinovy Meyler. We just wrapped up a conversation with Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons.
We asked them questions like, how can you prevent being scammed by malevolent actors, including by AI?
Yeah, and also, how accurate is your memory, and how being certain about your memory can affect your decisions?
Yeah. Also, are your choices throughout your day being influenced by subliminal priming or by other types of priming? And if so, what should we all be doing about that? And really, there's no one better that we could have been talking to about these topics than Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. First of all, they met in Harvard in 1997. They began their collaborative research there. And in 2004, they shared the IG Nobel Prize in Psychology, which is awarded for achievements that first make people laugh and then make them think. That was for their experiment that inspired the invisible gorilla, which if you haven't seen the invisible gorilla on YouTube, you really got to go check it out. But they continue to collaborate together and work on new research projects. And most recently, they came out with a book, Nobody's Fool. And the book is a must read. The basic premise of the book is basically that we all use psychological shortcuts in order to get through our day. And for the most part, those shortcuts tend to serve us really well. But sometimes those shortcuts lead us down the wrong path, or worse, they can be exploited by malevolent bad actors. And so we need to be aware of those as basically to build our immune response to those malevolent actors.
And they were a blast to talk to. They're fun, they're lighthearted, really know their subject inside and out, and give great examples, making it easy to understand some of these subjects that can really affect us on a daily basis.
Yeah, this is a really useful, interesting conversation that we really believe you're going to enjoy. So please enjoy. Daniel, Christopher, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. We know it's been logistically challenging to get all four of us at the same time, so this is great. Now, this is actually the first time that Zinovy and I have had two guests at the same time, and we have so much information that we wanted to get to, so we thought that we could maybe break this up and just have two parallel conversations at the same time. So it's okay, Chris, I'll talk to you, and Zinovy's going to talk to Daniel. Zinovy doesn't speak English so well, so I'll be translating in Russian for him, so it might get a little confusing, but I think if we concentrate, we should be able to, thank you. Not because obviously, yes, no. Listen, we really enjoyed your book. The basic premise of which seems to be that we have many psychological shortcuts in order to get through our day. And for the most part, those shortcuts serve us really well, but sometimes those shortcuts can lead us down the wrong path, or even worse, they can be exploited by malevolent actors.
That's right. And there are so many topics that we'd like to discuss, some of which are intuitive, but many are counterintuitive that we'd like to dive into. So we figured let's start with one that really took both Grant and I by surprise, and that's the Mandela effect. And it's hard to believe that Mandela is still in prison. And it's even harder to believe that some people might agree with that statement. So obviously we're being a little facetious, but we'd like to know, what is the Mandela effect and what does it tell us about the nature of memory and reality?
So first of all, the Mandela effect is not a real scientific effect. It's a name given to an experience that people have. And this experience first became popular on the internet in connection with what are in fact false memories about what happened to Nelson Mandela. So a woman realized at one point that she had a clear and vivid memory of Nelson Mandela having died in prison in South Africa in the 1980s or maybe the 90s, and that there were riots in the streets and so on, which is, of course, not what happened. He was actually released from prison, and he was elected president of South Africa, and he lived until around 2013 or so, and his funeral was attended by all the leaders of the world. Her conclusion from the contrast between what she remembered and what official sources, news reports, history books, and so on say is that there's something wrong with all those official sources and reports and history books, or even worse, that time has forked and she is living in a different timeline, or someone has messed with the timeline or with the physics of the universe or something like that, and what she remembers must be true, and what other people claim has happened must either be false or maybe specific to their realities or something like that. So the idea that the past is changing somehow, and the way we remember it in some cases is true, and the way it's recorded and the way almost everybody else remembers it is false. So that's sort of the Mandela effect. Obviously, it's not an effect that Mandela had on anyone or anything like that. And there's no one single like mechanism that's offered to explain why this is going on. But the one, I think, thing they have in common is the denial of the idea that this could be false memory or memory distortion on the part of the people who are experiencing these memories. Whereas we would argue that cognitive psychology and the science of memory sort of gives very clear explanations for how these could be false memories and why people seem to have the same false memories in common, and why they're so vivid for people as well.
Yeah. And we certainly, in medicine, we certainly see that a lot with, and accept it as a given with people that have brains that have been exposed to alcohol. So people with chronic alcoholism. And we know that as confabulation, but it's so hard to think of this as us doing it. It's them. It's a diagnosis that we give somebody, but we, of course, don't do it. We remember it very clearly.
And I think that's part of the issue, right? Remembering it very clearly is often taken as a sign that we remember it accurately. So when you have a really vivid experience and you sort of feel like you can play it back to yourself, we generally assume that it's right, because often things that are more vivid to us are more likely to be right. But that vividness doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. I have really vivid memories of how I learned about the attacks on September 11th, and I verified them, and it turns out they're wrong. I remember different people in the room with me who were actually there, but if I play it back in my mind, I still see several of my graduate students there who weren't there, and I still don't see the person who was actually in the room with me at the time we learned about it.
That is remarkable.
That's not how I remember it. So we have this feeling that our memory works like a videotape. So when we play it back, I guess now it's not a videotape, like a good streaming record of what happened. But we feel like it has that sort of vividness that must be reality. And that's how we can end up having completely conflicting memories of what happened with somebody else. They can say, no, it happened this way. But if you remember it vividly, you assume that their vivid memory must be wrong.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because to me, like I understand that, and we've talked to others like Adam Alter and stuff about how memory is not just like a streaming service, but that we can confabulate it. And yet, to your point, there are times when you say, well, that memory that I confabulated, like, no, not that one. That one's right. That one I know is right. Is there a mechanism by which we can identify when we might be confabulating it, or do we just have to always have a healthy degree of skepticism about our own memories?
I'd say you have to be skeptical, because it's more often than not, our memories are going to have elements of truth to them and generally be close to the reality, right? It's like an improvisation on a theme as opposed to an exact reproduction of it. So elements of it are going to be often quite right, but we often don't know when it's wrong. And we generally don't have anybody following us around checking to see if we're accurate. The people who do are politicians, and they often get caught out telling what people think are lies when it might just be that they're mistakenly remembering things and having to tell stories about them.
Are there ways that people might look to exploit that effect, or that that kind of fault in our memory?
Chris, you want to take that?
Well, there are definitely ways that we, in the case of the Mandela effect, for example, deceive ourselves. So one reason why we wrote about the Mandela effect was it's a great example of how when you commit to a particular belief, you can lead yourself down all kinds of paths that lead you open to self-deception or being deceived by others. So if you believe that your memory is infallible, at least on a particular topic, let's say, that what happened according to your memory is absolutely 100% what happened, then if that's a logically sort of fixed point, in your reasoning, well, then you can say that the laws of physics have been changed, or time has been forked, or, the world's intelligence agencies have conspired to edit all the videos of not only the news, but also the children's shows I watched, all the pictures of the products I, used as a child, and so on. For what reason? Who knows, right? That will lead you down further rabbit holes, like why would they want to do this, right? Who's behind it, and so on. All because you had this fixed point belief earlier on in the process. So, you can easily deceive yourself that way. And I think certainly there are people, right now who have an interest in getting people not to trust official sources of information, historical records, journalistic statements, and so on, basically just to make people more uncertain and confused, and therefore perhaps more susceptible to certain kinds of political manipulation and persuasion. That would be sort of like the most apocalyptic version of this. I thought it was interesting when you said, is there a mechanism that we can use to tell apart like the true and false memories? I had the sense that you were asking in the way that Dan answered, like, is there a way we can look inside our minds and tell the difference? Right. And, I agree with Dan, there isn't, but maybe we can look outside our minds and compare our memories to contemporaneous records. So, you can go back in your calendar and see, was I really in the place I thought I was? Or what did my emails say? Or you can do what Dan did and ask all the people who he thought were there, and see what they remember, and okay, you might not get to the absolute truth, but you may wind up realizing you're not necessarily right. Someone's got to be wrong, and there's probably an equal chance it's you as to any of the other people. So there are mechanisms. They just aren't like just introspection.
Right. Not like a checklist that you can go through and be able to say, well, if I check this many boxes, then it's true or not. Right. But there's the implications of understanding that is so wide ranging, right? From eyewitness reports to to the ideas of our own identity, because some people will have a pivotal point in their lives that will lead them in a certain direction for their career and so on and so forth, only to find out 10 years later that, well, that actually wasn't true, that 5 other people that were there really don't remember it the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we should be skeptical about memoirs, because they're often piecing together a really compelling story. And what you remember are the things that were consistent with your story, and those often get exaggerated a bit, and you leave out all of the chance factors that might have contributed to where you ended up. And so it's not an accurate reproduction of exactly what happened to you and what caused what, because it's a single path through history. You don't know really what caused each factor.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And if you like the memoirist, or you sympathize with them, or they impress you, you're probably more likely to think that their memories are true and their story is true. And sadly, there are a lot of like sort of almost completely fraudulent memoirs, like Holocaust memoirs by people who were like safe in Switzerland the whole time and not even Jewish, that have attained renown. And also a lot of like celebrity and CEO memoirs and so on. Like, if we like the guy, we loved his book, it was very, very useful and so on, but they probably got just as much wrong, if not more, as anybody else who's writing a memoir.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're much more forgiving to those that we like, even when we know they make mistakes. Like, who was that? There was a famous news anchor who famously, Chris Williams, is that the guy?
Brian Williams.
Brian Williams. On the one way of interpreting it is he just, stolen glory. He made up being in a war zone, and the other way is, he's been a lot of places and he got confused, right? And he really thought he was there, and who knows? I guess there's no way to know.
There's no way to know exactly what went through Brian Williams' mind every time he told that story about being shot down in a helicopter over Iraq and in the invasion of Iraq. But I think, Dan and I actually wrote an article about this particular case and a couple of others a while back. And one conclusion we came to is that I think this was 2015 when we wrote it. Now it's 2024. Like, there is really no excuse for repeatedly telling stories about your own greatness without sort of being aware that you could be telling untrue things and going back and checking the record. And ironically, like in his case, there were news crews filming all of this stuff with him, and he was still at the same news organization, the whole time. Like, NBC News was with him from the beginning of the actual events to the false memories he was telling. So someone could have looked up the video, and he probably should have, right?
having said what I said, I feel like I was way too generous with my comment.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I think you're right. Like maybe he didn't realize it at all.
Yeah, and it might not. I don't think it's too generous necessarily to him. It's the question of whether, because we all have these sorts of memory distortions and memory inflations, and the fish gets bigger in the telling every time for all of us. So if he's been in a lot of war zones over the years and he's reported in a lot of them, and maybe he's had some close calls, it's not an unnatural thing to kind of meld things together, combine them with stories he's written about other people, and end up with something that's not true.
And I guess when you're in the public eye all the time, also for politicians, for news, for
and politicians will have politicians who are at least prominent enough will have opposition researchers who they pay to look into their own records to make sure that they're not going to get caught up on something, and they should be doing that, right? And reporters should be extra careful when they're telling stories that make themselves look great, because those are the ones that are most likely to get distorted.
Friends, we hope you're finding value in the content. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider hitting the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on the notification button to stay up to date with everything going on in the channel. Can we talk about survivorship bias? There was a really great story in the book about B-17 bombers and how when they would come back, they're full of bullet holes, and they were trying to figure out how to improve the B-19 bombers so that they wouldn't be, the B-17 bombers, so they wouldn't be shot down the same way. Could you talk about that?
So it's a great story from World War II. And the B-17 bomber was one of the bombers that was used the most for long-range bombing missions over Europe. And they were pretty impressive planes. I mean, they could take a lot of damage and still succeed, but they were taking heavy losses. So the Air Forces were taking big losses. A lot of these planes were getting shot down. A lot of them were damaged. And the question was there something they could do to increase the survivor rate of these planes? And the intuitive thing when people look at all of these damaged planes is, oh, okay, well, look at all that damage. Why don't we just reinforce all of the areas of the planes that have been shot, right? Because if they're getting damaged there, let's beef them up. And what the military did was send all of their data to Abraham Wald, who is a statistician at the Columbia Research Group, who did a lot of analysis on this, actually analyses that are still in use today. And what he wanted to see was the damage random or not? And if the damage is random, meaning that an area on the plane is just as likely to get hit as any other area on the plane, so bigger parts of the plane will get more than smaller parts on the plane. If it were random like that, just kind of uniformly distributed across the plane, then there's really not much you could do to reinforce a part of the plane. But if the damage was not random, let's say some areas were getting hit a lot more than you would expect just by chance, then maybe you could do something to protect them. But that intuition that, oh, okay, well, this part of the plane got hit a whole bunch of times, let's reinforce that, is exactly the wrong one to have, because you're only seeing the damage on the planes that managed to get back. So if a plane was hit multiple times in the fuselage and still got back, well, the fuselage wasn't critical to its survival. You should be reinforcing any part of all the planes that came back that was almost never hit, because presumably the planes that got hit in those areas fell into the ocean or didn't make it back. So it's this idea that we only look at the evidence we have in front of us, and we don't tend to think about all the evidence that we're missing. So it's a kind of survivorship bias of the information. We're only looking at the success stories, or the ones that succeeded in getting back, and not all the ones that failed. And this is sort of a general principle that applies in a lot of contexts, right? So if you look at business self-help books or business, success books, you read about the CEO who had this great strategy that was really successful, and you think, oh, we should try that. Well, you're not going to read about all the people who tried exactly that and failed. Everything that ends up in that book is something that managed to succeed, and you don't get the missing stories of what they tried that didn't work, or the other people who tried the same thing and didn't succeed. So you have no idea about whether that's actually a successful practice or not from one person's narrative about it. But it plays out in a lot of scams and deception as well. So,
and of course, this is one of those things, as with a lot of scams and deceptions and so on. As I was reading the book and I was led down this path, my initial thought was, oh yeah, let's reinforce that.
Yes, me too.
Just like most people will try, which is great, which is why we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, it kind of leads to that question of like, what's missing? Like, what aren't I seeing?
Yeah.
Is this a good moment maybe to talk about the possibility grid that you guys developed?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you?
Yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah, so we sort of gave this name, the possibility grid, to a concept that's been around in psychology and behavioral science for a long time, which is that if you think about, if you think about an event that can either happen or not happen, and let's say a consequence that can either happen or not happen, or just any two things that can be sort of paired, they're sort of a 2x2 grid of possibilities. Like, for example, a simple one might be a stock picker example, right? So there's like a professional stock picker who wants you to, pay attention to his stock picks. And in fact, he really wants you to pay money to hear his stock picks, every month or something like that. And he tells you, oh, well, I picked Amazon in 1998 and I picked Tesla in 2011 or something like that. Which was, of course, for those two stocks right before they went sort of straight up and returned, huge wealth for their investors. So he's telling you about stocks that he picked and that went way up. So if you imagine, like, there are two kinds of stocks, the ones he picked and the ones he didn't pick, and they either went way, and then stocks can either go way up or not go way up. Well, he's telling you about two things that go in sort of like the upper left corner of that imaginary 2x2 matrix. So like on the vertical, you've got, did he pick it or not? And on the horizontal, you've got, did it go way up or not? So up in the upper left corner, it's he picked it and it went way up. But he doesn't tell you anything about all the stocks he picked that didn't go way up. And I think in this case, you could infer, if you know anything about stock pickers in the stock market, that no one, survives by picking one thing every 14 years or so, right? Like, they've got to be issuing new picks every year or every month for that matter in order to stay in business. If you got a stock newsletter that every month said nothing new this month, like, see you again in 30 days, you'd be like, why am I wasting money on this guy? Like, paying him money and he sends me nothing, or if he just says hold, like, well, you can get that on Twitter. You can get people saying hold on Twitter. You want professional advice, So, but not only that, so he must have had other stocks, right, that he picked, but he's just not telling us about them now. And not only that, but there were also probably lots of stocks he picked that didn't go up, that did go way up, right? And we know that those were there because he would have told us about them if he had picked them and they went way up. He told us about Amazon. He told us about Tesla. If he had also picked, MasterCard or Google or whatever, all of which had huge runs, AutoZone, whatever, like, those would all be in his ads too. So actually, when you think about the occupants of all those other cells in that matrix, those other three cells, things he picked that didn't go up, things he didn't pick that did go up, and things he didn't pick that didn't go up, which is most things because you can't really pick all the stocks, right? Then you realize those two isolated examples are probably not representative, of what's going on. And the question you should ask yourself whenever you hear anecdotes of success or anecdotes of anything really is, what am I missing? Especially in what is really an adversarial kind of context, like, that guy's trying to get you to send your money to him. I mean, he may be engaged in a more legitimate business than a Nigerian, fraudster or a Ponzi schemer or something like that. He probably sincerely believes he's giving out good investing advice, and if you follow, but you have to ask what's missing. What is this guy not showing me? And where can I find that information? Or even if you don't want to go look for the information, just you realize that this is unrepresentative, maybe just, go elsewhere for looking for investment strategies.
So one way you can think about that is it's not just the number of successes that matters, it's the success rate. And in order to know a success rate, you have to think about the total number of picks and the proportion of them that were successful. So that tells you right then, I have no idea what the total number of picks was. So I've got missing information right there.
Yeah. And it is so seductive if someone says to you, hey, I bought Bitcoin before Bitcoin was, big. It's like, oh, tell me more. But to your point, what aren't you, what's the success rate and what are all the misses that, and, if you give the stockbroker in that instance the benefit of the doubt, and you go back to what we were talking about before, they might confabulate it in their mind too and be like, I'm amazing. I picked these two, and just, you don't think about the ones that I don't need to spend time worrying about what I missed.
There are a lot of people who truly believe that they have psychic powers. Right? And why do they come to believe that they have psychic powers? Well, one explanation is that they remember their random picks that happened to come true in some way, or that they could convince themselves that they had picked those. Right. And they don't remember the ones that they didn't pick, or the things that happened that they should have picked. picked.
It's so weird because I knew you were going to say that.
Another good way to be right with your predictions is to make conditional predictions, but then forget about the conditions after they come true. So if he said, if someone said, if Amazon's new music business takes off, then it'll be the greatest stock ever. Well, that's a conditional prediction, then you remember years later, I predicted Amazon, but actually you predicted, right? And people make conditional predictions all the time. That's pundits, especially on TV, like you ask them for a prediction and they'll say, right, well, if Biden can get his campaign in gear and Trump has some legal missteps, then Biden will cruise to re-election, and then later on it's Biden will cruise to re-election. I predicted it,
I had this deep wish after the Iraq War, like some years later, wishing that all the pundits had to wear like a scorecard, where someone could go back and it would be like, we're like underneath on the screen whenever they gave another prediction. It's like 32% success. I mean, because it would be something like that, right? It would be tremendously embarrassing, I think, for all of that, especially, I think just in general, I think that would be true. And for the reasons that you just outlined,
I think the only one that I've seen do that is the Puxatawny Phil for Groundhog Day. I just want to wait and then you see, he's been 33% correct. Okay.
Well, if you were
that's useful. We should we should vote against.
Correct is not bad. Yeah, vote for the opposite. Yeah. I mean, if you're 100% wrong, that's great. You have perfect information.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very true. Very true.
Could we?
Yeah. Well, let's
pivot.
We're going to keep pivoting.
We're rapid pivot. Confirmation bias. Why should we be skeptical of findings that confirm our predictions?
So I'm not sure that we should always be skeptical of findings that confirm our predictions. I think we should just be, we should think about how often we don't question things that follow our predictions. And we don't tend to check things that are consistent with our predictions as much as we should. So, and that can lead to errors. So take the case of a scientific finding. Say I run a study and I've got two conditions. I've got an experimental group and my control group. And I expect this brand new experimental treatment to have big benefits. And my data come out and I look at the data and like, lo and behold, the experimental group was bigger than the control group. So great, publish it, get it out there, promote it, tell people to use this treatment. But imagine I made a mistake in my data and just got the conditions swapped in my data. So I've just made a dumb error. I switched Excel columns or something. Now that mistake is out there in the literature because the result was consistent with what I expected. Whereas had the results come out that my treatment did much worse than the placebo group, I would have double checked it because that was unexpected. That was weird. I want to look at that and make sure that I got it right and make sure everything was coded correctly. So a lot of the scientific errors that make it into the literature are ones where people found what they were predicting and then maybe didn't dig into it enough to realize, there was an error there. Whereas whenever there's something that's unexpected, you dig into it and try and figure it out.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example where checking what you expect, because that's where you're going to make errors, that's where you're going to make mistakes. And when it comes to deception, people who are trying to defraud you or con you know what you want. They're going to give you what you want to be true, what you expect to be true, and take advantage of the fact that you're not likely to check things that are consistent.
Yeah. And so I guess that would go along too with if they say things that are flattering to you, you're more likely to just kind of go along with what they're saying because you like what you're hearing.
I mean, that's one way to think about it, yeah.
On the other hand, if they're flattering you in surprising ways, then you might say, what's going on here?
Right.
The trick is...
They cross it.
Yeah. If they say, boy, Chris has a great head of hair, right?
Why was I thinking the exact same thing? I don't know. Somehow great heads think alike.
Yeah.
But that's the irony, sort of, is that when all of your expectations are being confirmed one after the other, and everything is unfolding as you expect, and you're getting exactly what you want, that's when our guard goes down, right? So what we're saying is you need to sort of develop a sensitivity to the fact that in important situations, you could be going down someone's garden path, and you should do a little bit more digging and make sure that what's going on is right. This happens a lot sort of at a broader level we can easily comment on the world of science, right? But in the world of science, often truly fraudulent papers that are published, like a scientist deliberately makes something up, it's just for whatever reason, not just makes an innocent mistake like Dan was saying, but truly makes something up. Those often get into the literature, not because they are like startling, amazing new technological advancements, because everyone's going to check those and going to try to develop products based on them and gonna, and so on. But they are sort of like very small incremental advances, clever studies that are consistent with what people in the field already believed, exactly the kind of normal science that kind of gets you grant funding, gets you like good positions in good universities and so on, or, pretty good universities. And that people don't really check into too much because it satisfies their expectations, right? They were expecting this result. Yeah. But if someone keeps on putting out, like, if someone puts out, like paper after paper after paper and always achieving the exact results they predicted and that everybody expects and so on, honestly, nowadays, I'm a little more skeptical in that circumstance. Like, how is this person so productive and right every time? Like, what is going on here?
Yeah. Right.
And of course, I mean, this certainly applies to the current, we're in the election year, right? And so to the world of politics, I really love the idea of the adversarial alignment, right? And the idea of aligning yourself up with the adversaries to your ideas, because so many of us exist in our own echo chambers. And of course, we like what we hear and it confirms our bias. And then we just go further and further down that rabbit hole. And it just puts us further and further apart and tears the country apart. And that's so hard, though, the adversarial alignment, right? And yet so important.
I think you can even take a step back and just be a little more hesitant to pass along things that sound great. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody, I shouldn't say anybody, but most people don't want to spread misinformation. Right? Most people aren't deliberately trying to deceive their friends. So, but we all have this experience of somebody posts a story or a headline that sounds consistent with our beliefs, that, maybe says something about our opposing political beliefs and says, that person's crazy, that person's terrible, they're evil, they're dumb, they have dementia. I mean, you'll see that from both sides of any political debate.
Yeah.
And we have this tendency to pass along and forward and like and reshare things that are consistent with our beliefs, but not things that aren't.
Yeah.
And of course, people who really have the goal of spreading disinformation and creating distrust, they don't really care which message gets spread. They just want all of the messages spread so that there's nothing believable anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think rather, in addition to having this sort of idea of a red team or people who are directly challenging you, which is really hard, you can challenge yourself a little bit. Yeah. So before you click share or like on something, read the article. Ask yourself, is this really true? It sounds great, but is it actually true? And what would I need? What information would I actually need to know in order to verify that it was true? Yeah. And for me, that just makes me a lot less likely to share stuff on social media, because how often can I actually verify the truth of something?
Well, and it sort of underscores too, at least for me, the big problem of not being able to trust the institutions the way that, in my mind anyway, that we used to. Like, it used to be, I'll speak for myself. If I saw something in the New York Times, you could, I would have thought 15 years ago, you can take that to the bank. Now, I don't know of any institution on either side of the political spectrum that you can necessarily say that, which just furders that problem, right? It makes it because we tend to be late. We only have a certain amount of energy that we're going to put into things, and most of us aren't, political commentators. So you look for sources you trust, and then you go from that. But if we don't take that extra step, to your point, then we end up down our own little rabbit hole.
Yeah, just looking to see if there's independent documentation goes a long way. Right? Yeah. So if somebody's reporting a story or reports a headline, are there other sources that are saying the same thing? Do they document their sourcing?
Yeah,
you can get a long way there. But I agree. It's the whole agenda of disinformation is to get you to distrust sources and not know what to believe.
Yeah, it's probably a good bet if you see people saying the same thing from different sides of an aisle. That's probably a good.
Mm-hmm. It's a good heuristic.
A good heuristic. Yeah. Something I was thinking about as you were talking about not fraudulent research, but just erroneous sort of or making mistakes. I think a big thing of that also is sample size, right? Because if you have a small sample size, but it confirms what you were expecting to see, you end up making, I think, much stronger conclusions. Even though there's always the prerequisite, larger sample size is needed, but you don't really mean it. Sort of, you're sort of like, this is what I knew I was gonna see. I saw it, and there was I think you guys were talking about in your book about there was a study from Adam Alter looking at, I forgot, it was a little while ago that I read it, and now I forgot. But you know what the study I'm talking was a
I remember.
blinding.
Yep.
And then a
Yeah, I remember.
What's that? Yeah, go ahead. It was,
Well,
it was so great because I didn't think anything wrong. Like, I mean, we know Adam, and I thought, okay, he had a small sample size, maybe over, maybe people got too excited about it. But then there was another study that refuted it. Okay, done. But to your point, not done, right? So anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, so it was it was Adam Alter and others. It wasn't just him. There was more than one author of this paper, and they had more than one study in it. And the particular one that we talked about was a study of 4 Princeton, as it were, as it happens, undergraduate students, and they were given these famous cognitive reflection test problems, like a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Which is sort of like a famous problem that people often get wrong. You're supposed to say 5 cents, but most people say 10 cents, and leave the math to you. And what Adam Alter's study claimed to have found is that if you just print the problems, like that exact text that I just said, in a harder to read font on the screen or on the paper, this sort of activates some notion of difficulty. Like, it's hard to read this. So I'm in a situation of difficulty and I need to exert extra effort, and then people will work harder to solve the problem and they'll be more likely to get it correct. So, what you have here sort of is like one question, 40 people, divided into 2 groups, presumably 20 people who saw it in one font and 20 people who saw it in the normal font. And, that's not a lot of data. We could go through sort of some of the math on like how likely it is that you're going to, see a truly significant difference that you can trust will replicate when you have thousands of people. But that's not the right sample size to come up with a strong conclusion on that. And, speaking of adversarial situations, right, in science collectively is kind of an adversarial collaboration, because there were people who didn't believe this. It didn't match their understanding of how people were supposed to go about solving these problems and how the mind works and so on. And they tested about 8,000 people and found 0 difference between the typefaces, made no difference at all, and published it years later. But the cherry on top of the story is that after that, you still had people writing about the original finding as though it was the one we should pay attention to based on 40 Princeton undergraduates, not a terribly representative sample of humanity, and footnoting the concept that, well, other studies have disputed this, but nonetheless, you should take our advice about how to design your user interface or your documents or whatever, based on this one study of 40 people. That's the really disappointing part, I think, where you can sort of see right in front of your eyes the sort of self-correcting nature of science fails when people still pay attention to the earlier uncorrected study, even when the correction has been published and they're aware of it. It's not like they didn't know about it. They cited it and they said, still, we should give some weight to this earlier one.
I think
How do you explain that? Why is it that the first one out has such an outsized impact?
I mean, I think
the font that they put it on, printed in.
That's right.
What a great twist that was. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it was in calligraphy, it turned out. Is what.
I think there are a lot of reasons why. I mean, partly it's just the first on the scene. So people have had time to think about it and talk about it and incorporate it into their worldview. And then the one that comes along later just doesn't get the same attention. It's the same principle that the accusation of murder is shouted from the rooftops and the correction appears on page C 27. There's a really nice heuristic to kind of get you to think better about this, and that ideally science would use, which is one that Andrew Gelman described as the time reversal heuristic. So imagine that replication study with 8,000 participants had come first, and there's no effect of type font. And then Alter and his colleagues had done their study with 40 Princeton undergrads and found a big effect. Would that change your view much?
Right.
Well, no, you'd have to say you need a lot more data to refute this giant 8,000 person study, right? With 40 undergraduates. Maybe your study was a fluke.
Right.
Well, if we were doing the correction of science correctly, what we should do is say, okay, it doesn't matter which one came first. They're both studies. Should we wait? How should we weight these two things? Yeah. And ideally, we should weight the big one, if it was, assuming it was done correctly, weight the big one more heavily than the small one. If they're the same study, just different sample sizes, you weight the big one heavier. But we don't do that because we have this what came first bias. And that's a real challenge in a lot of contexts, right? You have to think about, okay, would I have had the same view if it were the opposite order?
Yeah.
And
I think that the disappointing and the really humbling part of that is that I understand it easily when you say about the person yelling, murder, he did it and then on page 6 it gets corrected and
it's a difficult thing to do, right? And it should be not a hard thing to do. Right? It should be for somebody who's looking at both of those findings side by side. It shouldn't matter which one came first.
right.
There's no sort of inherent truth to the one that came before and the more than the one that came later. But I think there are a lot of people who don't quite understand sampling error. So they'll assume that if I got this result once, it must be true, and that anything that comes later and doesn't find it must have done something different. There must be a reason, as opposed to just, I had a fluke.
Right.
There was a mistake.
You think there's an
And
element
not
also of
necessarily
wanting to
somebody doing
believe it?
anything wrong, just
Yeah.
they got a fluky result.
You think there's any element also of just wanting to believe the more interesting finding?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's. I think most of the times you'll find that the direction of memory favors the counterintuitive, counterintuitive result over the boring one.
Yeah.
Like if I had tried to publish that I wasn't a co-author of this, but if I were, and I tried to publish an 8,000 person study of how making math problems harder doesn't make people better at answering them,
Right.
no, I wouldn't have been able to publish that study because people would have said, why on earth did you study this in the first place?
Right.
We don't expect this to be true, and so on. If they would say something like, if this were true, we would have figured it out already, because like math teachers would have started using like weird fonts and everything. And in fact, math is in weird fonts already, and yet people still find it hard. Like people would have all kinds of objections to this thing. But once it's done in response to the original 40-person study, okay, then it got a little bit of publicity, but still it was not easy. And it didn't, it didn't carry the day. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I probably, if we really looked at it, like ultimately the Adam Alter paper is probably getting cited a little bit less than it was before, but not zero. And probably there aren't too many more people doing research on varying the font and trying to make people better at math problems. But that doesn't stop it from being presented to the public as, as a real thing.
There's definitely an element of inertia in any field of science that just kind of carries through, and we see it historically through such dramatic things as germ theory, and Semmelweis saying, well, we're contaminating people, and then he ends up dying penniless in the psychiatric institution, and then it takes 40 years before people say, oh yeah, germs, yes.
Yeah. Of course, there's also a danger that everybody, that cranks will assume that they're one of those people who just was misunderstood and they had it way before everybody else. So
Right.
I think there's a sort of meta science issue here as well, which is that, let's say you're the first one in to publish that paper. You publish this flashy finding, right? Well, another lab comes along and tries to replicate it and doesn't get the result. Who reviews the non-replication? It goes to the original authors, who then can try and find anything that was different. And if you don't have a strong editor who says, well, why should we give priority to the finding that happened to be out there and statistically significant as opposed to the other one? Is there any reason to think that the methods that they happen to stumble on are any better than the methods that the other crew happened to stumble on? But when you've got a situation that's adversarial like that, you submit a paper that's questioning somebody else's results, saying this probably isn't true. They have a vested interest in finding problems with your design. And they'll be able to. They'll find things that are different, right?
Yeah.
And
You would hope that they wouldn't, but at first that's not how humans work, right? You hope that that people just want to know the truth, but
so it's easier to publish the counterintuitive, interesting finding than the negative finding in the first place.
A lot of priming research ended up going down this path, right? If I understand, that was sort of really disappointing reading your book. I was really sad about that because it's such an interesting, fun research that is counterintuitive, sort of like that what we were just talking about with the Adam Alter study. But it turns out that a lot of it just isn't. It doesn't pan out on large sample size.
But you wouldn't really want to live in the social priming world, because it would be so easy for you to be jerked around by every stimulus in your environment, and for even easier for people to influence you and control you if the effect sizes that are in that literature are really true.
Right.
So, if your judgments and decisions were so influenced by the temperature of the object you're holding,
Right.
or, what people had just mentioned to you right before and so on, like, I don't think you'd really want to sort of have such a loss of autonomy. It doesn't seem appealing. It doesn't seem appealing to me, but I agree with you that literature is collectively, I think, a case study in how a couple of really interesting initial findings going back, I believe, to the late 80s, I think, or even the early 80s were sort of the very first ones, like the late 70s, early 80s, but it really picked up in the 90s with some splashy findings like, if you make sentences with words that relate to being old, then you'll walk more slowly down the hall when you leave. That's right there an example of a very cool, counterintuitive, clever, and plus Malcolm Gladwell popularized it in his book Blink, which always helps. And you had an explosion of literature. Basically, like, I would say it was almost a competition to find the next most interesting, clever finding like this. Right. Like when you're literally physically outside a box, you're more creative. Because you're thinking outside a box, right? Like the metaphor race got, went metaphorically to the stratosphere, in that, and they have a very poor record of replicating when other researchers try them with larger sample sizes and better controls and so on. And it's unfortunate, but I'm sort of glad the world doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Well, there's a certain dichotomy there, right? I mean, on one hand, it's great that the world doesn't work that way, and I feel so grateful that I can't be manipulated that way. But some Machiavellian element is wishes that, well, if my idea is great, so if I give you a warm cup of coffee and turn the temperature right, then I can sell that idea, right? So there's a certain dichotomy of wishful thinking, but at the same time being glad that nobody can manipulate us.
It's kind of fantastical thinking, right? I mean, it goes back to the 1970s with the subliminal perception craze, that you could be persuaded to buy more popcorn or drink Coke at the movie theater, which actually was a hoax. It was an advertising executive hoax. But that idea pervades popular culture, the idea that really subtle things can have these giant influences on our behavior without us realizing it. And that's really the underpinning in many ways of that particular kind of priming literature, that these subtle things that we don't know anything about are having these giant effects on us. And I think one of the sort of big lessons from that literature is to think critically about how plausible are effects of that magnitude, right? And as Chris was saying, if these things really were the case, we'd be buffeted around constantly by everything we encounter in our daily lives. We'd have no autonomy at all. It doesn't make sense. And the same sort of principle can apply in other contexts, right? If people could truly predict the future, why aren't they all millionaires, right? And they're not. But in that same thing comes up in a lot of contexts. So one of the topics that I've studied and Chris has studied as well is cognitive training, right? Interventions to kind of stave off cognitive aging, brain training games. They're pervasive everywhere, maybe finally dying down a little bit as a craze. But the claims were that by playing this video game or whatever for 10 hours or then 30 hours, it's going to have these dramatic effects on your basic cognitive abilities that's then going to apply to all sorts of real world settings. But if you think about it, what are the things that you're doing in these games? You're maybe playing a first-person shooter game, you're moving around and doing things that are fast-paced, but you do that when you walk down the sidewalk in any major city. And
I hope I'm not a first-person shooter every time I'm at the sidewalk in a city. I'm trying to avoid them,
But you're trying to avoid people, and you're trying to avoid cars, and you're paying attention to things going on in your periphery. And all of those things are things that we have to do all the time. So if we're doing all of these things all the time, our experience is just going to be overwhelming. Any experience playing this game is going to be overwhelmed by our hundreds or thousands of hours of real world experience. So why would we expect them to have a big effect?
Right.
And the answer is they don't. So
they get you good at those games.
You get good. You get really good at the thing you practice.
That's a specific skill rather than a transferable skill.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about priming that's disappointing is I blame basically all my bad decisions on priming. So, so I lose that excuse if this research goes out the window.
But I think comparing any sort of effect you see to anything that you can think of that would have that sort of influence in your daily life. So, in a priming study, if you think, okay, I'm going to walk more slowly down the hallway if I descramble sentences related to aging, what other factors could cause me to walk more slowly? And how big are those effects?
Yeah.
So if I'm really fatigued, maybe I'll walk more slowly. Well, probably the effect of being tired on your walking speed down that hall is smaller than what was reported in those papers. Is that plausible? Right. So thinking about what's a plausible effect, and are these bigger than that? And quite often they are.
Yeah, it's not just right. It's because
And they're also continuous.
Right.
They're not like a one-time thing. Like you're done with those words like a few minutes before you walk down the hall, but you're tired the whole time you're walking,
Right.
you know, or you're distracted on your phone the whole time you're walking, like every step of the way, literally, you know. So that's, yes, Dan's exactly right. Like those effects are out of proportion to what you would expect from anything that's that small and brief. It's kind of like, you know, something like an antibiotic has been discovered, like a pill you take for a week that prevents you from dying. You know, it's not that level of effect. It's the mind, you know, doesn't work that way. Like you can't manipulate people on the level of antibiotics and vaccines, you know, the way, you know, the way people would like to believe.
Right. And it's not to say there might not be some small, subtle effect of some kinds of priming, but that, you know, just that not
sure.
the size effect that we,
If you look at the literature on subliminal perception, right, which is a literature that goes back way before this priming stuff, it goes back, you know, to the early 1900s. And what you find in that literature is that every time somebody would propose this sort of an effect of subliminal perception on a judgment, and it's, you know, you'd have other studies that would come along later and debunk them.
Yeah.
And even the strongest hardcore proponents of the idea that we can kind of process the meaning of things without being able to consciously report having seen them, the strongest proponents of those will say these are tiny effects that are short-lived, meaning hundreds of milliseconds, not walking down the hall short-lived, lasting for fractions of a second, and are really, really hard to observe, and you have to do tons and tons and tons and tons of trials to get an average effect that's tiny.
I feel
That's the
obliged-
proponents. Those are the advocates of the effect.
So I have to ask you about subliminal perception a little bit because so I in high school, I had to do a science project. We had to run a study. My dad's a professor of psychology at Princeton, and somehow we designed this subliminal perception study. Then we got a guy in the lab to clip in a soda into a Bart Simpson's episode, and we saw an effect versus placebo. Obviously small, right? High school class, but large enough that my dad thought, let me give it to a grad student and see if they can replicate it. And they replicated it, and they published it. And I'm sure it was a really small sample size, and I never followed it because I could care less about what the subliminal perception research is. But in the back of my mind, I had always, because I remember all of those, you know, there was the thing about the, there was a book about, because of the way they drew the Howard Johnson's sexualized,
this was
like
Key's Subliminal Persuasion
or
book from
something, people ended up
1973.
eating- that was all like debunked basically. But I kind of walked away from that one study thinking, okay, so there is something to subliminal perception. That was like 1990. Has it completely been debunked, or is there a phase of it that survived?
People who study it seriously are not looking at persuasion because the effects are not long lasting if they are
this was
there.
thirst, by the way. This was trying to make people thirstier.
Yeah, which is very much like the original hoax.
Just like the movie theater thing that wasn't real.
Yeah. There's very little evidence for subliminal persuasion of that sort at all.
I might have the only evidence for it.
So
What you don't realize is that he clearly remembers it. He clearly remembers it.
I mean, you know,
No congratulations there whatsoever.
one of the first studies I did as an undergraduate was on priming. Same sort of thing. But so it's a kind of an appealing notion that, and priming, I should say, priming of the sort that we're talking about is different from what priming is typically studied in cognitive psychology. So there are plenty of priming effects, like if you're trying to judge whether or not something's a word, and the word that you're flashed is the word doctor. But right before that, you saw the word nurse. You're slightly faster, slightly better able to process the word doctor, having just seen the word nurse. Whether that can happen without you seeing the word nurse, there's very little evidence for. Right? It's only if you saw it and you got a benefit of having seen it right before you make another judgment.
That makes sense.
But that effect,
that makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, that effect is smaller than most of those claims of subliminal perception, and smaller than the social sort of priming effects that are on behavior. It's actually not a big effect. You have to do a lot of trials to get it, but it's there. It's robust. That sort of semantic priming, you can get those effects. You can get faster performance having just done something before. Basically, you're greasing the perceptual system to do the same thing more efficiently, or very closely related things more efficiently. But the sort of having an effect on behavior stuff generally doesn't hold up. And when you apply tighter methodology to it, it goes away. Yeah.
Can I pivot?
Please.
Something that I really wanted to get to. I know we're running short on time. My son is really into chess. I know both of you are into chess as well.
Chris especially.
Chris is, I think, you're like, are you a grandmaster? You're a.
No, but I wish I were. No, I'm just an ordinary master. National master is the official title. National master.
I don't know why you don't insist on everyone calling you master. Something that I had a lot of chess with. Maybe I could start with this. I really liked. I'm always curious about how you can apply things you learn in chess and ways you think about the game to the rest of life. And something that you write in the book is that in chess they say, you can open doors by asking yourself 3 questions. What's the worst placed piece on the board? Where are the weaknesses? And what is my opponent planning? How can we use that in real life? Is there a real life out of chess correlate?
Well, I don't know about the worst place piece in real life and so on. Like those are like really specific pieces of advice that chess coaches may give to their students. And it sort of has the quality of like easy to remember, like 3 things. I can remember 3 things and make a habit of asking myself those 3 things. Not necessarily like every time you play a chess move in every game you're going to play, but like if you're having trouble thinking of the right move, or the position is kind of calm, and it's time to try to make some improving moves or something like that, you can use those questions. But what they're designed to do is sort of make you think of more options that you might not have thought of otherwise. Like if an experienced chess player, or even a not experienced chess player, looks at the chessboard, some moves look more obvious. Like maybe a beginner says, "Oh, I want to move my queen and use my queen to do something. The queen is powerful." Maybe a master thinks, "Oh, I should move my pawns or something like that." But there's always some moves that sort of like strike you when you look at it. Those might not be the right ones. So the point here is to like help you generate more questions to ask or more options to consider. And I think a big trap in decision making is not considering enough options, right? That's a trap in general in decision making, right? Because almost always there's something that seems good, right? There's some default, there's something that seems good to do, there's something that presents itself. And when it comes to situations of deception, one big problem we have is not asking enough questions before we make a decision. And those could be direct questions to someone who's like trying to get us to do something, or they could be questions to ourselves or questions to other people. But ways of generating more questions is, I think, really important. And, in chess, our opponent's not always trying to deceive us, but it's a complicated situation where making the right decision is hard. And I think we can take lessons from that can apply in like other complicated situations in real life, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I like the idea of when you're trying to get more information, you guys, right, say things like, say more. Right? Say more about that. And it kind of opens people up to give you more information you may not have gotten otherwise.
It's a nicer way than saying, "Hey, you haven't told me everything yet."
Yeah.
That is nicer, yes.
What are you telling me is kind of a combative, but say more is pretty friendly.
Yeah. Is that something that we should all get in the habit of doing, you think?
When it matters, right? So there's some contexts in which you don't really necessarily want to hear anything more that somebody has to say. So asking them for more information is maybe not the best.
You said too much.
But anytime you're in a situation where you're having to make a difficult decision and there's an information asymmetry, right? Any negotiation, any sort of context, a patient talking to their doctor, right? The doctor knows a lot more than they do and often won't say everything that they're thinking, right? For
Right.
lots of reasons. But if you want to know more, you can say, "Can you tell me more about that?" And most people will then start telling them more, and then that might raise other questions that you have. So it's kind of a natural way of eliciting more talking, more information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm always impressed by people who say that, because I feel like, well, I guess one possibility is they just don't want to contribute, so they just get other people to keep talking. But I think given the kind of people I've heard this from, they're often sort of like high status people, but who are willing to admit that they need more information, or they're not ready to make a decision yet, or we need to discuss this more, something like that. Because I think there's always sort of like this impetus, like let's say when you're leading the meeting, when you're leading the team or whatever, to have quick reactions, and to always know what the next thing to do is, and even to cut people off, without letting them finish, but actually then saying, "Tell me more about that." Like that's kind of a rare move, in the conversational game. And it sort of impresses me when I hear it. And I think it impressed us enough to think that people should sort of make a habit of using it more often. Because especially sometimes when people are trying to trick you and deceive you, like they've got a set amount of information they want to convey to you. They don't want to tell you anymore because they've sort of learned that, like, if I tell people this, like they might, they might, so of course, maybe more specific questions is better. Like if you're being pitched like some, bogus crypto investment or something like that. Like, I don't know how well Say More is going to work with, with those people. Right. They might just have their pitch and they might just say more bullshit, right? And then you've got to be able to tell the difference between the bullshit and reality. But I think in a more serious situation, you can even just get like a longer stream of information about which to evaluate someone's credibility, right? There's some great stories we found when researching the book about people who were sort of talked into wiring like millions of euros to people who they never met and so on. And, sometimes I think that they might have discovered that like the guys would run out of, would run out of material at a certain point, if they could have kept going, especially if they were putting up a really fancy act, as part of it.
Those were amazing stories, by the way. And like wildly depressing too, to see how people can get sucked into them. And one of the things that I think you mentioned in the book is that one of the ways to avoid, if you feel yourself being sucked in, to ask somebody else with, just for a fresh perspective. And because sometimes all it takes is for them to say, that doesn't sound right. Right. And then it kind of wakes you up and like, whoa, how did I find myself here?
Yeah. It forces you to check those assumptions again. And right. If somebody's pitching something to you, they're appealing to all of those sort of intuitions and preferences and expectations that you have. But somebody coming in the middle of that won't have those same commitments. They won't have made those same assumptions, and will have a fresh take on it. So it's a good way of just stopping and saying, okay, this is another source of information. This is independent observation.
Yeah. Just to give you the specific story that is one of my favorite ones, there was a scam where these guys pretended to be the French Minister of Defense, and they created a prosthetic mask to make themselves look like the French Minister of Defense, and they had Skype video calls with people who they were trying to steal money from, essentially. And what they said was, I'm the Minister, well, they said in French, obviously, but I'm the Minister of Defense and so on. France can't pay money ransom to get hostages back, we can't pay money to terrorists and so on, but you can pay money to the terrorists and we'll pay you back. And that way we'll all be like serving the French Republic and you'll get your money and you'll be great patriots and so on. And it was, of course, the you'll get your money back step, that never actually happened. Right. But let's say you get the call and someone says like the Minister of Defense wants to talk to you. And these are not random citizens, right? These are pretty prominent people who conceivably could have been spoken to by the Minister of Defense or would find it an honor to be talking to the Minister of Defense and so on. Well, if you accept that you're talking to the Minister of Defense, everything after that is going to go a different direction than if you wonder whether you really are. So that guy who comes into the room later, while you're on your third call looking at this fuzzy image of a guy who sort of looks like the Minister of Defense, and so on, but you can't tell because the camera is oddly positioned like 20 feet away from him, that guy will walk in and say, there's no way this is the Minister of Defense. They haven't bought into that assumption, that right. You were basically like you said yes to that assumption at the beginning and you haven't questioned it since then, right? Yeah. But they have not bought into it, and then they can see all the signs that are inconsistent right. with the assumption that that you already made, and you're behind it. That's a commitment you've already made.
Yeah,
and you're past
like
it.
The Mandela effect in that way, right? Well, once you put this stake in the ground that this is real, everything else flows from that.
Yeah.
And
that's often how cult-like behavior progresses, right? You start out with some assumption that the cult leader is infallible, can't make any mistake, never tells a lie, and then you have to just jump through all sorts of hoops to make everything they do consistent with that. Mm-hmm. But once you've started jumping through those hoops, if you start with that initial assumption, you can end up way down some weird rabbit hole with all sorts of strange beliefs that to anybody on the outside look absolutely crazy, but are all logically coherent to somebody who's accepted that initial premise. And that's often why it's so hard to kind of communicate between groups that have different starting assumptions, that they've gone down these logical paths.
After you jump through, then you also have the dissonance of, I wouldn't have jumped through. I'm not an idiot. I jumped through for a reason. So now you're even more committed.
Yeah, exactly.
And away you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. One more quick pivot, because both of us talked about the weighing of the information.
Oh, you're going to do this one, right?
Yes. That's what we wanted to ask you about. And just to kind of comment about the story that, or study that when doctors were given information and then the second piece of information, if you could speak to that.
Chris, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So that's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite studies was done by Donald Redelmeyer, and I think Eldar Shafir, maybe, two giants of judgment and decision making research. And the idea was that people don't necessarily weigh the information they've received independently of how it came to them. So in this case, how it came to them was manipulated in an interesting way. So one group of doctors were told a story about an airplane ride, an airplane flight, and a patient was having chest pains and maybe symptoms of a heart attack. And they were the doctor on the plane, and they measured the pulse, the heart rate, and were also able to measure the blood pressure. And then they had to make a decision. So they got those two values, right? You said the pulse is this, the blood pressure is that, systolic blood pressure is that. Do you think the plane should land or should it carry on? Basically, a decision about like how likely is it that this guy's experiencing a heart attack that we need to land and get him to to the hospital right away. A second group of doctors, doctors had been randomly assigned to these groups, so this was sort of a pure randomized experiment, was told the first set of information, the pulse, and then they were asked, there's a blood pressure cuff on board. Would you like to get the blood pressure also? And if they said yes, they were told, okay, the systolic blood pressure is X, and that was the same number as the people in the first group. So doctors who asked for the additional blood pressure information were in the same position after getting it as those who were just told it without them having to ask. Yet there was a big difference in how likely they were to recommend landing the plane. And I can't remember the exact numbers or not, but there was a substantial difference in how likely they were to make that recommendation. And, Redelmeyer and Shafir attribute that to overweighting of information that you have a role in acquiring. And in this case, it was merely asking for it. But you can imagine situations where you do a lot more than just ask and are handed information. Like that probably happens in the hospital a lot, right? Like someone asks for information, someone reads it off of a monitor or does a test or whatever, or you read it off yourself. But imagine like you've spent hours and hours or days and days and weeks doing research on something, right? That information that you gathered is probably going to have, an even greater influence on your decision making. Maybe that's part of, in fact, the reason why people who do, lengthy experiments that then get, sort of refuted by later research still cling to the initial ones, right? Because they played such a large role in getting that information. But it's an easy trap in decision making, and a lot of times in deceptive situations, we're dealing with information that people may give us the opportunity to ask for or to get by ourselves, and we have to be careful not to overweight that information.
Yeah, it's wildly humbling when you see these, especially in your own discipline. So like you, I think it resonates with you more about the research side. For us, I think it's like, wow, we order these things. You order tests all the time as a physician, and like I don't know. Are we weighting the data that we probably? I had never thought of it until I read your book about.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we learn in medical training, further in medical training, is to ask ourselves the question of how will this test change your course of action? Will this change the clinical outcome? Because certainly I didn't think of the fact of how much buy-in we have after having sent a patient to do something. Because it isn't just asking for that information at that point, right? We had them go through some kind of an arduous test, and then we have that information. Well, obviously we needed that information in order to make that decision, so it's going to weigh way more, and we're going to we may make decisions that otherwise we wouldn't make.
Yeah, especially if it wasn't information that was necessarily going to lead to a different diagnostic treatment, right?
Right.
You're going to take it into account when really it might have been irrelevant.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's so important that this is one of the reasons why books like yours are so key, because we all make these. We're humans, and we all have these automatic processes that we fall into, and you can. I guess the best way to negate them, I think we'd all agree, is to be aware of them.
Yeah.
Right. That has to be the starting principle, I would think.
That's the first step.
Yeah.
That's the first step, is to be aware of them, and then I think also to try your best. And I know it's hard. Like I work in a health system. I know it's hard to slow down in, doctor-patient encounters and so on. It might not be possible all the time, but when you think people might be tricking you, like, you really have to slow down and recognize that there's more time to make the decision than you realize.
Yeah.
You don't have to make a decision on, sending all your money to a crypto, fund today or whatever. Time pressure is terrible for decision making. That's pretty much universally clear.
Yeah, I did think, by the way, that I loved, I think what you were saying about the Nigerian scheme, that the best way to make that go away is if everyone starts emailing back people doing that.
Yeah.
Because then they'll be overwhelmed and they can't focus in on the ones, because essentially they're able to filter out most skeptical people because they don't write back. So the ones that do write back are much more likely to be scammed.
Yeah.
So if we all write
that's
back,
the rule. Right.
then we will crash them.
This is the public announcement.
Public announcement.
Public service.
Yeah.
Right back to your Nigerian person. Just don't give them
And
money.
just make sure you're not going to ever send them any money.
Exactly.
Well, the awareness of this is so much more critical as we're getting further and further into the AI possibilities, right? Where cloning of the voices and the faces and video and deep fakes are so commonplace, or becoming more commonplace.
It means that we have to take more preventative steps, because making that decision based on the information we have is going to get harder and harder. So one of the things that I've done is kind of go back to if you guys grew up in 70s or so on, you might remember all of the scares about stranger kidnappings, and families would have a password so that if somebody else was supposed to pick you up after school, or somebody claimed that they had been told to come pick you up after school, you ask them for the family password, and if they don't know it, you run.
Yeah.
Well, you can do the same thing to prevent these sort of voice cloning scams. I have a family password for my family, and we know that if somebody calls and claims to be in trouble and claims to be one of us, you ask for the family password, and if they don't know it immediately, you assume it's a scam.
We made a family password after I read your book. I was like, oh, okay,
Good.
yes, because how else? There is really not a lot of other ways around those kinds of things.
And the nice thing about it is it takes you out of having to do work in the moment, right? And the real challenge is if you get that call and they're putting you under pressure, they're making you terrified, something horrible has happened, they're keeping you on the line, they're doing everything they can to keep you from asking, wait, is this really true? Does this really make sense? Should I just text my kid and see if they're fine?
Yeah.
That effort to keep you on the line and keep you from doing that, from questioning more, is really hard in the moment, and we're not good at it. So if you can have a preventative measure that lets you check, that can take care of it in the moment.
Well, listen, we have pages of more questions, but I think we've got to let you go. And this is a good segue into your next book of the Nobody's Fool AI edition. Yeah. Which we will be looking forward to, because we all need it. This is a great one for today, and then the AI for when AI really starts ramping up, and we're all
Yeah, we really enjoyed your book. And
it's a great book. It's a must read.
Glad to hear it.
100%.
Thanks very much.
For taking the time, guys. This has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot. The book is a must read, 100%. It's just packed with, it's fun, and there's so much great information in it. So we really enjoyed it.
Yeah, glad you liked it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Friends, thank you for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you find value, please remember to hit the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notifications so you can stay up to date with everything going on with the channel. And please leave us a comment, let us know what you thought about this show, and also what you'd like to hear about in the future.